Hello, Angie. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today about your experience in the climate sector and your budding climate career.
Yeah,
So first of all, tell me a little bit about your position this summer and what you're doing with TCI.
sure. So I am a policy fellow here at TCI. I'm sponsored through the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute. So I'm also technically a sustainability fellow with them. But here at TCI, I'll be working on the policy toolkits. So I'm going to be adding to the collection that TCI has, working on New Jersey and South Carolina and looking at the climate policies that they have implemented or not implemented, and also kind of a history of the state's climate-related legislation. And I'm also going to be working on some development for the climate action plans that TCI is doing. So that'll be later down in my internship. Yeah, so I'm super excited to be here and we get to dig into all of this stuff and explore climate policies for states that I don't really know a whole lot about.
Awesome. Okay, so I know that there's this policy side of things, right? But can you tell me a little bit more about how that directly relates with climate change?
Sure. So from what I've been reading and researching, what comes to mind right now is New Jersey, because that's one of the states I'm working on. And there's a lot of research on the science of the impacts of climate change. We know what's very likely to happen, what's already happening to the state of our planet and to communities. And what policy does is it helps facilitate behavior change in people so that we can work more as a collective towards these solutions that help mitigate the impacts of climate change. So, like, for example, different states, including New Jersey, have these climate action plans at a state level where they're working to increase resilience in their communities and really support communities. They also just passed this environmental justice legislation. I believe they're the first in the country to do that. And so what this does is it really tries to protect environmental justice communities, so often marginalized communities that might be more at risk, much more at risk of pollution and toxicity from corporations that come in. So New Jersey has passed this legislation to pretty much hold these corporations accountable and say, no, you can't develop on this land because it's going to overburden these communities. So yeah, it's pretty neat. I still have to dig into the details, but yeah, policy facilitates climate behavior change to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, it's pretty direct. It's like a pretty direct correlation.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So how did you get into this career track? How did you get interested in working in the climate sector?
Yeah, so I had always been interested in nature, and in my undergrad, I studied neuroscience. So I was really just completely fascinated by how the brain works, how that impacts people's decision making, how it impacts people's learning and memory, and kind of their knowledge structures. So I was more interested in this cognitive side of neuroscience. But I knew in undergrad that if I didn't do something with climate change work, I would feel like I just wasn't fulfilled. So I started to try and think, I didn't want to abandon neuroscience. So I tried to think, how can I bridge the two? And what I ended up doing was focusing on my undergraduate thesis on how environmental decision-making is impacted by our ability to conceptualize the future, and also how our values develop over time, and at what points in childhood, what points in adolescence, etc. So that was super interesting work. And it's funny because I kind of see my work with TCI, it's almost like an application of a lot of the stuff I learned in my thesis. Yeah, so that's kind of was my entry point into climate work, was that focus, that more academic focus. And I started this policy branch in this organization at my undergrad at UT Austin. So it was focused on negative emissions technologies. And what the policy branch really focused on was looking at what are local solutions that we could implement today and recommend to our local decision makers. So more along the lines of wetlands conservation and soil sequestration. So we worked on that, and that was really what kind of opened up my doors to the working world of climate change jobs and careers. So from there, I had networked with one of the organizations we were working with, the Energy Futures Initiative, and that ended up being my first internship, then turned job after I graduated undergrad. So it was a clean energy think tank, and I just really got the chance to learn more about the complexities of climate change there. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's perfect. You're perfect. So tell me a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in kind of getting into this career.
Yeah, I think the first challenge was being able to find experience in climate change work, in environmental work when I didn't have that background. My degree wasn't really directly related to environment stuff at all. And so that was my first challenge. And that's where the negative emissions technology project really came in, because it was, pretty much volunteer work that allowed me to get some experience. But kind of going back to what we had talked about earlier was that I had good credentials. I had worked really hard in undergrad and I got some environmental experience on my resume, but I found it really, really hard to get a job related to the environment and related to climate work. And it wasn't until I leaned into that organization that I had worked with for the negative emissions technology project that I was able to get a job. It just felt like a lot of rejections and no for a lot of internships. And yeah, it really showed me the power of networking and what it really means. Everyone says it's important, but it wasn't until then that I realized it. So getting a job was difficult when I didn't have a background in it. But I think that has been the most significant challenge up to now. And possibly also having that it's been a big learning curve for me and just teaching myself and trying to understand what are real climate solutions versus more just almost propaganda, greenwashing. So also not having more of a structured background in environmental stuff and science. That's been a bit of a learning curve to try and navigate and figure out what's real.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I too struggle with the job market. And, talking about the propaganda and what are real climate solutions, that's been such a kick in the pants to discover, what are we really doing here that has an impact? So it makes sense why you went into policy, because there's such a direct correlation there between behavior change, like you said, and the work that you're doing in policy.
Right.
So my last question for you is, what gives you hope? Working in the climate sector can be really discouraging in a lot of ways. So what gives you hope?
Yeah, I think a number of things give me hope. One is definitely the youth and seeing enthusiasm that people younger than me have for working in the climate space. I did a little bit of volunteer work with this organization that was focused on youth engagement and writing an amicus brief to the North American International Court of Human Rights, and just seeing their passion and dedication was just so inspiring. But I think also what inspires me and gives me hope is, it's funny because I am working on a lot of policy stuff, but lately I've been really reflecting on how much we can do just as communities without formal policy too, and seeing communities get together and just implement strategies that are much more local, much smaller scale. So that's been really hopeful. I guess most recently, and I had mentioned this at our all-staff meeting, I learned about El Paso, Texas. That's my hometown, where I learned about how they have been champions in water scarcity management and have really served as a model internationally for countries in the Middle East and countries in Southeast Asia that are struggling with potable water. And just seeing how El Paso implemented local policies to get locals and residents to use less water in their daily lives, but also how our utility director for the water sector would go to Mexico and do a lot of binational negotiations with our sister city in New Mexico, Ciudad Juarez, and they just collaborated a lot without any kind of formal treaty or anything. It's all of our progress and success with clean water and water conservation with Mexico has been based on the handshake that they had and lunch conversations. And so that gives me a lot of hope, just knowing that people have made there is progress being made, and it doesn't have to be so formal. People are interested in connecting with one another and collaborating on solutions that work.
That's cool. That's super cool.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is you don't need policy to make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, and I really appreciate it. And me and the rest of our listeners wish you well in your climate career.
Thank you.